very honest. But he's doing the job for us. We needed somebody that understood everything. I don't know if he understands.
I don't still understand it. I got some questions tonight. And I hope, I got an accountant that I want to refer to.
Are you getting the things that you asked to get?
Most of them. Where, I can't get it where I want to. P&C has it wrong.
Yes, they do. I wish we would change.
What does that stand for? I saw that.
I do not know.
PNC?
I do not know. Megan can probably tell you because Megan was working for, what was the name of the bank before it turned? Community. No, Megan already left. Whatever it was before community.
Well,
is
that's
what Megan
So it
was.
started out as
the higher you get, the less
And
work
then
you
it
get.
changed to,
I don't know what it was.
it
I
was
think
what,
Lumberton bought it out before.
yeah, I can't think what it was called. Megan worked for it.
Really do classes, you know,
And then-
it's a lot of,
Oh, I saw that on the
guided study.
Bridge of it up there,
Yeah.
next one up there.
Their electronic interfaces work. They're supposed to have it fixed on.
All right, Belinda, what psalm are we on?
86, buddy. I done beat you to it.
Give me 5 minutes. I'll make it up.
You know, you could write that on this, cast. Where you have
I was gonna write a note and put it up there. Hey, good morning. I didn't see y'all come in. I'm his secretary. Did y'all not know that?
Oh, boy, are you
All right.
in trouble.
What
Well,
psalm
I'm
did
not
you say?
here. You can never remember where
did
he
you
said.
say 87?
86.
86?
We read 85 last week?
Yeah, that seems right.
Yep, that's right.
All right,
I write it down.
Psalm 86. Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Preserve my life, for I am devoted to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. You are my God. Be gracious to me, O Lord. For to you do I cry all day long. Gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. For you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abounding in steadfast love to all who call on you. Give ear, O Lord, to my prayer. Listen to my cry of supplication. In the day of my trouble I call on you, for you will answer me. There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, nor are there any works like yours. All nations you have made shall come and bow down before you, O Lord, and you shall glorify your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You alone are God. Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Give me an undivided heart to revere your name. I give thanks to you, O Lord, my God, with my whole heart, and I will glorify your name forever. For great is your steadfast love toward me. You have delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. O God, the insolent rise up against me. A band of ruffians seek my life. They do not set you before me, and they do not set you before them. But you, O Lord, are a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Turn to me and be gracious to me. Give your strength to your servant. Save the child of your servant girl. Show me a sign of your favor, so that those who hate me may see it and be put to shame. Because you, Lord, have helped me and comforted me. And Lord, we pray that your Spirit will be present with us this morning as we study your word. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right, so as we get started, we are in Mark chapter 2. We finished up last week talking about the first story in chapter 2, Jesus' healing of the paralytic. At the end, we had this statement that we talked briefly about. Jesus says, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Now, I want to begin this morning by talking, well, I won't be talking, letting somebody else talk real briefly about this term, Son of Man. We've talked about it before. If you remember, I did a series, I don't know, a year or so ago about some of the names that the New Testament uses for Jesus. So we talked about Jesus as Messiah, Jesus as Son of Man and Son of God, and some of that language. And so we've talked about this before. I just want to briefly remind us, and we're going to let the Bible Project, short little 5-minute video, just do a brief reminder of the significance of this term Son of Man, because it will continue to come up as we study through Mark.
If you read the New Testament, you'll notice that the most common title people use to describe Jesus is the Christ. That is, the Messiah.
But surprisingly, Jesus almost never used that word to describe himself. Instead, he called himself the Son of Man.
The Son of Man. What does that mean?
Well, the phrase comes from an important chapter in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Daniel was an Israelite prisoner of war who was forced to live in the empire of Babylon and work for the prideful, violent king who destroyed his home.
That sounds horrible.
And while he was living and working in Babylon, Daniel had this crazy prophetic dream. You ready for it?
I'm ready.
He saw 4 beasts crawling out of a dark sea, hybrid monster-like animals, each scarier than the one before. And the 4th beast is so mutant, there's nothing to compare it to. And it's violent, leaving death and destruction in its wake.
What in the world is this about?
Well, he's told that these beasts symbolize violent, prideful kings and their empires.
Oh, like the one Daniel's enslaved to.
Yeah, and these creatures might seem random to you, but these images are developing an important biblical theme. How humans are these remarkable creatures, capable of doing great good and horrible evil.
How we can behave like animals.
Right. Look at the first pages of the Bible. God creates the beasts of the field and humans together, all from the dust. But then the humans are set apart and given a royal task of being God's image.
So humans are like the animals, but called to become much more.
Yeah, they're to be God's representatives on earth, ruling on his behalf, like kings and queens. But keep reading, and the humans are deceived by a beast who says that they could be more than just God's partners.
Yeah, that they could rule the world on their own terms, which sounds good to them.
But God knows this will be a disaster, and so he expels the humans to the realm of the beasts.
The partnership is lost.
But God makes a promise that one day a human will be born who won't give in to the beast. Rather, he'll overcome and strike the beast while being struck by it.
Okay, so for the rest of the biblical story, we're waiting for that human. But instead, in story after story, we find people acting like beasts.
Yeah, like in the next story about Cain, who's jealous and angry at his brother Abel. God warns Cain that he's facing a beastly urge called sin, a dark, mysterious kind of evil that consumes humans. But God says that Cain can rule the beast if he chooses.
But he doesn't rule the beast. He lets this urge devour him, and he becomes a beast.
And then after this, Cain's children spread their animal-like violence, and it leads to the founding of a whole civilization known for its beastly pride, the city of Babylon.
Okay, Babylon. So fast forward, this is where Daniel is enslaved, having this bizarro dream.
Exactly. Now, watch what happens next in Daniel's dream. He sees into God's throne room where a court is set up, and God condemns the beast to destruction.
That's great.
And then Daniel sees that there's actually more than one divine throne.
Oh, right, the throne that humanity left behind.
Right. There hasn't been a human who's able to overcome the beast and rule alongside God until now. Daniel sees a figure called the Son of Man, which means a human. And he rides on a cloud up into God's presence and then sits down on the divine throne to rule the world.
The partnership's renewed.
Yes, and even more, all humanity worships and serves this Son of Man alongside God.
Oh, worship? So this is no ordinary human. This is like a God human.
Exactly. And so now you can see why Jesus of Nazareth, when he came onto the scene centuries later, chose this title, the Son of Man, for himself. He was claiming to be that truly human one on a mission to confront the beast.
He was tempted to seize power on the beast's terms.
But unlike every human before him, Jesus resisted the urge. And then he went about banishing the beast from people's lives, and he was teaching people how to rule the beast instead of being ruled by it.
Okay, so how do you rule the beast?
Well, Jesus did it by giving up his life.
Wait, rule the beast by dying?
Yes, when Jesus was on trial in a human courtroom and being condemned to death, he said, From this moment on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at God's right hand and coming on the clouds.
But this is the moment he's about to die.
Exactly. From one perspective, the cross looks like a beastly torture device, but Jesus viewed it as his throne. And on this throne, he exposed the subhuman nature of our evil by letting it do its worst, and then he overcame it with his divine life and love. Jesus' execution was his exaltation.
So Jesus is the first human to overcome the beast, and as a result, he can partner with God to rule the world.
And so now, Jesus is summoning a new humanity into existence, one that can overcome the beast in the same paradoxical way.
To rule the beast by dying.
And then by discovering that Jesus' life and power can become our life and power. So we can rule the world as God's partners, but Jesus style, in the power of service, humility, and self-giving love.
All right, I want to make a couple of brief comments and then we'll just kind of move on that kind of summarize a little bit of what was said. With Jesus, the term that Jesus uses for himself is never Messiah, Son of God, anything like that. He uses this term, Son of Man. And what's interesting about it is nobody else ever calls Jesus Son of Man. You don't see people in the crowds or the disciples calling Jesus the Son of Man. You never see anybody in early Christianity, any of the early Christian confessions, confess their belief that Jesus is the Son of Man. That's something that is unique to the mouth of Jesus. And as they talked about, Son of Man, at its most basic level, means human being. And so Jesus is just calling himself a son of a human being, which is a human being. But the language that Jesus uses does seem to pick up on that language of Daniel chapter 7 that they talked about, where this Son of Man comes on the clouds, which the gods come on the clouds, the Son of Man who establishes an everlasting kingdom that destroys the evil kingdoms of this world, the Son of Man who is worshipped. And so as they talked about, this is no ordinary human. And Jews at the time would not have interpreted that necessarily as this human is God. So Jesus kind of transforms this understanding a little bit. But they would have seen in it something a little bit different, a little bit unexpected, something abnormal for just a human being. And so this language connects. That's one of the things I want us to see. If you remember, Mark tells us that when Jesus begins his ministry, what he does is he preaches about the kingdom of God. There's a new kingdom, a restoration of Israel that is coming into the world. It's at hand. And then Jesus does these miracles, particularly casting out demons, that shows the power of this kingdom. What is this kingdom going to look like? Well, the poor receive good news, the lame are able to walk, those who are demon-possessed are cured. So Jesus preaches about this is the kingdom that I'm bringing, and his ministry demonstrates this is what the kingdom looks like, and that connects to him calling himself the Son of Man, because he's saying in the same way that Daniel had this vision that this human-like figure was going to come and bring about a kingdom that would bring an end to the kingdoms of the world. What Jesus is saying is that's the kingdom that I'm talking about, this kingdom of God that I'm preaching about and performing miracles to show you what it looks like. That's the kingdom that Daniel foresaw back in Daniel 7. We'll pick up on that language some more as we continue through the Gospel of Mark. Let's continue here in Mark chapter 2 into verse 13. If you remember this section, chapter 2, are controversy stories, one controversy after another, that kind of build up as we work through this section. The first controversy was over Jesus healing this paralytic and proclaiming his sins to be forgiven. Now we have a controversy between Jesus and the religious authorities over him eating with tax collectors and sinners. Verse 13. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples. for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." There's a lot of things that I want to talk about in just this short little story. And so I'll try to work through some of these things rather quickly. The first is the question of Levi. Who is this tax collector named Levi, son of Alphaeus? And you might be surprised to know it is a lot more difficult to figure out than you might realize. So, we're introduced to this tax collector, Levi, the son of Alphaeus. Now go over to Mark chapter 3 and verse 13. Jesus begins appointing the 12 disciples, or the 12 apostles. We'll talk about who they actually are when we get to that section of chapter 3. But if you look through the list of the 12, towards the end of verse 18, there's this guy named James, son of Alphaeus. And so some have wondered, well, is James also Levi? Does he have two names? We know people had two names back then, right? Peter goes by two names. He's Simon Peter. Paul was Saul, and then Paul. Paul's name, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Paul's name was not changed from Saul to Paul. He had two names. Saul is a Hebrew name, Paul is a Greek name. And when God tells Saul, the Hebrew, you're going to go and proclaim the kingdom to Gentiles, he says, you're now going to go by your Gentile, your Greco-Roman name, which was Paul. He didn't get a brand new name. He just starts going by his other name. And so we know that people had multiple names. And so it's possible, people have argued, maybe James is also Levi. Maybe James is Levi's brother that we just don't hear about, and he becomes one of the 12. Maybe there's two Alphaeuses. You have Alphaeus, the father of Levi, and Alphaeus, the father of James. I don't know off the top of my head how common of a name Alphaeus was in the first century, but you can imagine, like today, that there's at least two people generally who have the same name. And so all of our names in here, we probably all know someone, or at least a character on a television program or something like that that has the same name that we do. So that's not out of the question. Here's where it gets more complicated. We won't do this morning, but if you went over to Matthew chapter 9, Matthew has his version of Jesus. Matthew has his version of Jesus naming his 12 disciples. Before that, Matthew has his version of Levi the tax collector, and it goes pretty much exactly like Mark's. There's this guy named Levi, son of Alphaeus. Jesus calls him to follow, and they have a meal at his house. Matthew's account differs because in his account in Mark, in verse 18, we have somebody by the name of Matthew as one of the 12, and Mark just says Matthew. In Matthew's account, it is Matthew the tax collector, which is for Matthew to try and connect this Matthew the tax collector in his list of the 12 back to his story of this guy that Jesus called to come and follow him, the tax collector in the previous chapter. Matthew connects these two stories together and says that Levi is not James, or connected to James, son of Alphaeus. Levi is Matthew the tax collector, who is part of the 12, which is something that Mark doesn't say. Which leads us to wonder, is the Levi that Mark is talking about, is it the same that Matthew is talking about? Or is this Levi Matthew? Is this Levi James? Is this Levi the brother of James? Is this a different Levi? That's a lot to say. We have no idea who this Levi is. And here's part of the reason, probably why, is because if you think about the 12, there's 12 people that are at kind of the center of Jesus' ministry, but we don't hear very much about them. Like, when's the last time you've had a sermon on Thaddeus? Probably never, because we know absolutely nothing about Thaddeus. Same with most of them, the Matthew, the James. We don't know very much about the majority of the 12. James and John, we remember, though they really don't do all that much. They come to Jesus and they want to sit next to him in the kingdom, but that's about all we know about James and John. We remember Thomas because he doubted, but that's about the extent that we know about Thomas. Peter becomes a pretty prominent figure. Jesus, he's prominent in the Gospels, he's prominent in the book of Acts. Outside of Peter, we don't really hear anything about any of the 12. And so what likely happened over time is that some of these people and names that nobody really remember kind of get mushed together. And so when the Gospels get written, you have a little bit of overlap between people where we can't quite remember what these guys' names were or exactly how they fit in the story because they're not all that important. Now, the connection of Matthew, the tax collector, in the Gospel of Matthew back to this story of Levi is why some think that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, because you get that addition of Matthew, the tax collector. There are some problems with that. I actually just did a podcast on the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. There's some issues with doing that. But at the end of the day, the identity of this Levi, is he, in other words, for our discussion, is this Levi part of the 12 apostles? Is he related to one of them, or is he not? We have absolutely no idea. To me, that's important to mention because if you go and pull a generic commentary off the shelf, they'll probably try to connect Levi to the 12 by going out of the Gospel of Mark and to the Gospel of Matthew. But I've mentioned there's quite a few problems with that, and I would just rather say we don't know for sure. The other thing that we don't know is what exact type of tax collector he was, but since Jesus is walking about and he comes across this man at his tax booth, it says in verse 14, he's likely what we would think about as a toll collector. So there were tolls that you had to pay in the first century when you traveled from one area to the other. So you might remember when Jesus is born, the language of Herod the Great ruling this area. So Herod the Great ruled the entire area of Galilee and Judea and Samaria, and all of this area was ruled by Herod the Great. Herod dies early into the first century, and the area is turned over to his sons. So it kind of gets spliced apart. And when you would move from an area owned by one son to an area owned by another son, you might have to pay a toll or a tax to move from one territory into the other. This seems to be kind of what Levi is doing, because Jesus is walking around. He's sitting at his toll booth, likely at a road where there's a crossing from one territory or another, or Jesus is up in the area of Galilee. We know that he does a lot in Capernaum, right along the Sea of Galilee, and so he might be along the sea, so someone traveling from one side of the Sea of Galilee on boat to the other side of the sea, maybe to bring produce or something like that. You would be moving from one territory to another, and you would have to pay your tax to enter into the territory. Not all that much different than taxes and tolls that we have to pay today when you move from one area to another, or move produce from one country to another, or something like that. So Jesus is walking through, he sees this Levi, this tax collector, sitting at his toll booth, and says, "Come follow me," and then goes and sits down at Levi's house with other tax collectors and sinners, we are told, to have a meal.
I had read where tax collectors had to be real proficient in mathematics?
Possibly, not necessarily. We tend to, this is my opinion, we tend, I think, to have these kind of romanticized ideas about some of these professions in the ancient world. The way that you became a tax collector was generally you bid for the right to become one, so you paid for the right to become a tax collector. And you were given a job of we'll use today's currency, we need X number of dollars, or back then we need X number of denarii at the end of the year, whatever the period may be. And they didn't really care how you got them that money, just as long as the government got their money. And so tax collectors were generally connected with dishonesty, because what a lot of them would do, you've probably heard this before, they would charge people more than what they owed, and they keep the excess. And so they really didn't have to necessarily be that adept at math, because they weren't really doing math. They were making up their own amount that they would want people to pay, and they were just setting, you had to be able to, I guess, count, but most people could, and they would set aside, well, this is how much I have to pay the government. Again, that's not all that different than the way that we do just with normal taxes, right? You get a paycheck, you have some set aside, either yourself or by your employer, to go to the federal government to pay your taxes that are due at the end of the year. That's the way that tax collectors work, but they got to set their own salary. They got to determine how much they were paid, so it determined how much was left over after they paid the tax at the end of the year, which was connected to dishonesty. But another reason that people didn't like tax collectors is because you think about Levi, who seems to be a Jew. He's working for the captors, right? Jews are under captivity by the Romans. They don't like that. They want their independence again. They want their kingdom to be reestablished, which interestingly enough is what Jesus comes and says, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm reestablishing the kingdom of Israel. The problem with tax collectors is that they're working for the government. They're working for the people that are in control that the Israelites want to be overthrown. And so it is a little odd that Jesus comes and says, hey, I'm bringing the restoration of the kingdom, and someone that I want as a part of it is working for the kingdom that they would think had to be overthrown first in order for Israel to be restored. He's not the guy that you would think that Jesus would say, hey, I want this guy, partly because of the dishonesty, right? So they were connected with sinful behavior, but also because, well, he's working for the government that Jesus, isn't that what you have to overthrow in order to establish the kingdom? So in Jewish writings, we see that tax collectors are sometimes lumped in with murderers and thieves. They're associated with Gentiles. So if you were a Jew collecting taxes, you might as well not be a Jew. You might as well be a Gentile outside of the people of God because of their dishonesty and connection to the Roman government. And this is the man not only that Jesus calls to follow him, but he decides to sit down and have a meal with, which was also problematic. We talked about this a little bit before. Table fellowship was important in the first century. And part of the reason was because houses were open. So today you go into your house, you close the doors, you close the blinds, nobody knows what's happening or can hear what's happening on the inside, right? In the first century, houses were open. You didn't have windows, you didn't have doors, you didn't have blinds, you didn't have those kinds of things. So not only could you hear what's going on in other houses, but you could walk past and look in and maybe see what's going on in there. So if you sat down to eat with someone, everyone likely knew who you were eating with. And so it was generally assumed that you are connecting yourself to this person. There's some kind of connection. And so my identity is partly going to be determined by the people that I'm eating with. So if I eat with thieves all day, people are going to assume that I'm also a thief. If I sit around and eat with Pharisees all day, they're going to assume that I'm a Pharisee. I'm part of the religious elite. I'm educated, something like that. And so for Jesus to decide to sit down with tax collectors and sinners, Mark tells us, is for him to, at least to a degree, identify himself with these tax collectors and sinners. Is to kind of say we're in the same boat. And
You walk by a house, and you see them eating, just invite your shove in.
yeah, and your Jesus' ministry here with the people that he eats with, something that's I think important to realize is that his ministry was attractive to people like tax collectors and sinners. So we see there's controversy with the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious elite, but the tax collectors and sinners want to be around Jesus because his ministry and early Christianity as a whole was very much a grassroots movement. It didn't, at least not at the beginning, it didn't attract the rich and the powerful, but it attracted the lowly, the outcast, the poor, the diseased. These are the people that Jesus chose to spend his time with. And we could dive into that a little bit more and think about, I have a question that I wrote down here, is what has Christianity turned into today? Christianity over the centuries has kind of turned less into a grassroots movement and more into a religion of the privileged, where churches, unlike the ministry of Jesus and early Christians, tend to surround themselves with the rich and powerful, which Jesus' ministry didn't attract. They didn't want to be a part of it, rather than the lowly, the outcast, the poor, the diseased. So I think there's something in these people that Jesus chooses to eat with. It could be said about the way that we operate, the people that we surround ourselves with in the church today. But
Did that particular thing happen prior to or after Constantine?
We know what happened. We know rich people were attracted to the Christian faith to a degree early on. Luke writes his gospel to Theophilus, who was likely a patron that financed the writing of the gospel. And so Theophilus would have had to have the means to pay for that gospel to be written. And part of Luke's audience is probably Theophilus and people in Theophilus' circle, so other people of means and prominence, which is likely why Luke spends a great portion of his gospel talking about money and wealth and how terrible it is, which is interesting, maybe not the thing that most people would say to a partially wealthy audience. I don't think that was the only people in Luke's audience, and maybe not even the primary people that Luke expected to read. But I think definitely Luke thought that was part of his audience. But we also see in the early church, in Acts and in Paul's letters, that there were people of means that were able to provide houses for the church to meet in. So the churches in different cities met likely in the home of someone who had the means to have a home that was able to provide for that number of people. Because we know that at least early on, that every time they gathered together, there was a fellowship meal that they would engage in, and part of that meal was the partaking of the Lord's Supper. And so you likely also had to have people of means that were able to provide this meal. And you might remember one of the problems around the Lord's table in 1 Corinthians 11 were that the rich were eating and the poor were left hungry. So the rich were providing a meal only for their rich friends, and the poor were, well, bring your own. Well, they didn't have anything to bring, and so they were left hungry. And Paul has to be like, you're making a mockery of the Lord's table. So we know that the Christian movement attracted some people of means early on. What happened with Constantine, when it becomes the religion of the empire, is Christianity gets in bed with politics. And politics government is all about money and power and authority. And so what you end up having is you have, when Christianity and politics get brought together, you have this struggle of power and money and influence. And you can look throughout the history of Western Christianity, particularly in Europe, and you can see that struggle of Pope and King going back and forth for 1,000 years about who has the most power. Is it the Pope or is it the King? Who's really in charge? And when you move to the to 1517, and y'all didn't know y'all were getting a history lesson today, but when you move to 1517 and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, so it begins in 1517. Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral in Wittenberg, Germany. Interestingly, this is free, by the way. Luther didn't nail his theses to the door of that cathedral in order to start a Reformation. He woke up the next morning or the next week and was the leader of a Reformation that he did not intend to start. The way that it worked is that professors at universities, which is what Martin Luther was in essence, they had to have public debates every single year with other academics. And so what you would do is you would put together these theses, and another academic would come and they would look at them and they would choose one to debate you on. Because if you know anything about debates, and I'm assuming that you don't, we don't do debates as much anymore, and I'm assuming none of y'all have ever been a part of a debate, but I did a debate at Freed-Hardeman University a few years back, and one of the most important things about a debate is what is the topic, right? So you never want something, a topic that has the word like always in it, because if you have to argue the affirmative, that this statement is true, there's virtually nothing that you can argue persuasively is always the case. Because the other person, all they have to do is show one exception, and you've lost the debate. So it's very important the way that you word the topic. And so what they would do is they would have the same topic, and they would word it a number of different ways. So if you're feeling nerdy this afternoon, go into Google and search Martin Luther's 95 Theses and read it. And what you'll find when you read it is there's only like 5 topics, but they're all worded like 20 different ways, so that someone could come through and pick, okay, I want to argue on this topic, but based on this wording, based on this premise. And the bulletin board for the university was the door of the cathedral. So what Martin Luther does is he does what he has to do every year, and he nails his theses to the community bulletin board. And people began to read it, and they were like, this is a bit edgy, this is a bit controversial, we like it, and now he's leading a Reformation movement. But that has nothing to do with where I'm going. When the Protestant Reformation began, one of the things that was attractive to people of power, particularly kings and queens of Protestantism, was that you got to break away from the Pope. One of the reasons when you read throughout history, it seems, at least to my reading, that it was generally accepted that the Pope had more power than the king. Because it's believed within Catholicism that salvation is only found through the church. And it's through the church that you have access to Jesus. It's through the church that you find salvation. Which is actually true. I might describe it a little bit different than my Catholic friends would, but I'm on board with that premise. But the Pope is the one who has the power to excommunicate, that is, to kick out of the church. If you're not in the church, you're not saved. And so the king can do a lot of things, but they don't measure up to eternal salvation, which is in the hands of the Pope. when the Protestant Reformation happens and Protestantism enters in and they break away from that ecclesiastical authority, and by that what I mean is it was much more of a grassroots movement in we don't have to listen to the authorities in the church. We can all read our Bibles and do our own thing, right? Which to our Church of Christ ears sounds great. There's a lot of problems with that as well. When everyone is out doing their own thing, you get a lot of crazy forms of the Christian tradition. But nevertheless, what that allows is people a power to gain their power back. I can be a Christian, I can gain my power back, but I don't have to go through the Pope to do it. There's nobody that can excommunicate me. And so now I can remain a Christian and use that to continue to reign and rule over my people. Because again, they would teach divine right to rule. I am king because God made me king. And so if God made me king, you have to listen to what I have to do. It's the same argument that American slave owners made of where you're in this position, I'm master because God has placed us here, so you have to be subservient, because kings in Western Europe made the exact same argument centuries before it was made by slave owners here in America. But it became a way for the powerful to use Christianity to enhance their power and wealth. The Bible also says to pay taxes. You have to give me all your money. Right? You have to honor those who are in authority, so you have to do whatever I say. A lot of twisting of Scripture in order to maintain their power. And I could talk a lot more on that, but that's where we get to today, and some of the problems with Christianity throughout the world today is we have not broken away from a Christianity and political power coming together, and the entire history of the Western world is a saga of why that is a bad idea. Let me give you another example, because I have 2 minutes left. We're not going to get back to the text. So let me give you another example. I don't know if you knew this, but the reason that Hitler was able to rise to power in Germany is because of the support of the church in Germany. If Christians had not supported Hitler, Hitler would have never gained power. And Hitler was not really subtle in his rise to power about his anti-Semitism. He didn't get power and then, oh, by the way, I don't like Jews. He was, from the beginning, I don't like Jews. Here was the sales pitch to Christians. These Jews, who don't believe in Jesus, by the way, who you don't think are going to heaven, by the way, they're the ones that have all the money. They have all the wealth. They have all the power. Don't you Christians want that for yourself? And Christians said yes, and they supported Hitler, and that's what led to the Holocaust. It's a very simple description of what led to the Holocaust. It was a lot more complicated than that. But it was, again, and this is in modern Western society, an example of what dates all the way back to the problems that began with Constantine, Christianity and political power and wealth coming together. And it ends in a lot of death. I mean, the history of Western Europe is carnage over different religious opinions. So when a king would be Catholic and then a queen would rise up and be Protestant and want to kill all the Catholics, and vice versa. I'm assuming you've heard the term in some form or fashion used of Bloody Mary. Queen Mary, who killed all the Christians who are not a part of her group. And so it not only leads to gaining power and gaining money, but typically to violence against those who are opposed. Which is a very, very different form of Christianity. That's back to our point. It's a very, very different form of Christianity than what we see in the ministry of Jesus, when he eats with tax collectors and sinners and the poor and the blind and the lame. And even a very different type of Christianity than we see in the early church, where there were people of wealth, but they shared their wealth, right? You see in Acts of everyone had all things in common. If anyone had a need, it was provided for by others. You saw people going and laying their funds, selling their land and their homes, and laying the funds at the apostles' feet to be distributed as anyone had need. It was a very, very different approach to community and to wealth and to power than what ended up happening once it became the religion of the land. Anyway, there's a lot more that we could say about that point, but I think it's an interesting point to make. As I said, that's why in my notes I had, what does Christianity look like today? And you think of what the ministry of Jesus looks like, and in a lot of ways it looks quite different. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. We're going to pick up and finish this story next week. We're going to talk a little bit more about who the sinners are that Jesus is eating with, a little bit more about why the Pharisees have a problem with it.